another quick introduction. So excited to have another virtual lecture for you and to welcome Dr. Amundson to talk to us about the fall and rise of Arizona's elk. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Dr. Amundson share his.
All right. Let's see. Hey, everybody. How's everybody doing? I'm going to just talk a little bit about this project to begin with. Nikki asked me for a short title. This appeared in the Journal of Arizona History last summer with a really long title. And I was trying to find ideas for a shorter title. So the Fall and Rise of Arizona's Elk, or what I like in sort of that 19th century subtitle, alternative title, Arizona's Elk and Their Ilk, I think makes a good title because this is about elk as well as replacement elk. This actually started as a project. I was teaching a class on writing at NAU, and I decided I would try to do all of the work that I was having my students do. And so I did the work throughout the semester, and I found that to be a very onerous task to do the work and grade everybody else's work as well. But I stumbled into a really great repository of information about this story, and I'm going to share that. That's really the basis of my article and the basis of my presentation, is a treasure trove of correspondence that's at the Arizona Memory Project between a doctor from Prescott who wanted to bring Arizona elk and then all of the other people involved in it. And all of this story is collected into one beautiful archive. So here we go. We'll start off. In January of 2018, Arizona Game and Fish managers captured 6 elk from northern Arizona and transported them to West Virginia, where the native eastern elk had been exterminated more than a century earlier. According to the Flagstaff Arizona Daily Sun, the operation cost about $40,000 to construct the pen that held them and another $40,000 to pay for the crew that captured and transported the elk back east. And here you can see them using helicopters and transporting them and blindfolding them, and just how amazing this was. West Virginia partnered with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to shoulder all costs for this. It was a remarkable project in a number of different ways, most notably because these were not native Arizona elk. Yeah, they were born and raised in Arizona, but they were descendants of translocated elk who had been moved from Yellowstone National Park in 1913 after Arizonans had exterminated our own native elk a decade before that. This project in 2018 had been partnered by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. When Arizona got its elk, it also had a non-government agency, the Elk Lodges of Arizona, to help pay for the cost of bringing elk to Arizona. There are now about 35,000 elk in Arizona, and they are all descendants of about 24 translocations that occurred between 1913 and 1968. And so I think as we're starting to ship our own elk someplace else, it's a good chance to sort of look back and take a look at our own history of elk in Arizona. Now, this story has been told a number of times, but primarily it's been told as a game management story. That is how sort of from a fishing game, a wildlife management. And this book, if you haven't seen it, Bringing Back the Game, is a really good, very thorough study of elk and deer and mountain lions and wolves. Really an interesting story from a game management perspective about how Arizona has repopulated our hinterlands. I wanted to look at this story in a different way, through the lenses of environmental history, political history, cultural history, and then this newfound, the new up-and-coming history that I really didn't know anything about when I started, but was directed towards this, animal history, which is really looking at the history of sort of an environmental approach, but from the animal's perspective. And I'll give you a little bit of sense of that as we get into this. So this is my article on the left. The big picture that I was trying to talk about in this article, as well, that I'll talk about today, are really four big themes. The first one is this idea of what historians call imperialist nostalgia. Imperialist nostalgia is a really odd sort of phrase, but it's a longing for something, a nostalgia for something that you've had a hand in destroying. And so we see imperialist nostalgia in Flagstaff when we clear cut a forest and then put a shopping mall there and call it the forest. Okay, we see this in naming. It's recreating something that we've destroyed. And this is very much fits for the Arizona elk because we brought elk in after we had exterminated our own native elk. This is also a story in state politics. We're already seeing in 1913, Arizona had been a state for a year, and already we're starting to see political divides between urban and rural, between north and south, between Phoenix and the rest of the state. And that's already showing up in this story. It's also a story of hybrid nature. And hybrid nature is an environmental history term that really talks about how, it really goes back to William Cronin's book, Nature's Metropolis. And he talks about how nature, sort of as it exists on its own, has been transformed into a nature created by humans. And hybrid nature is one in which if you don't have enough water, you dam streams and provide water. Hybrid nature is if you don't have enough snow, you make snow. And Arizona is full of examples of hybrid nature like this. If it's not cool enough for you, you provide air conditioning, which we certainly know about today. And so this story also fits into this one of hybrid nature, as well as I talked a little bit about animal history. And that is really trying to look at this story from the animal's perspective. What was it like for an elk to get rounded up in Yellowstone National Park, stuffed onto a train, on 3 different trains, transported over 1,200 miles, and then set loose in Arizona? How did they do? What did they think? Well, I'm not going to have any sort of mind melds with elk to give you an idea of what they thought, but it's going to be maybe trying to understand it a little bit from their perspective. The story then is really one of two different things. The first one I wanted to look at was how were the native elk? What were the Miriams elk? And how were they exterminated? And what could we learn about them? The stories that I had read initially said that Miriams elk, and I'll talk about this in a minute, were mostly in eastern Arizona in the White Mountains, that they weren't really too prevalent anywhere else. And I was able to use the Arizona Digital Newspaper Project to find lots of examples, and I'll talk about that. So first, it's the extermination of Arizona's native elk. And then the second story is the reintroduction of Rocky Mountain elk from Yellowstone to Arizona in 1913. And I would tell you that along with women's suffrage, these were 2 of the biggest projects that the state did in 1913. And we'll talk a little bit about this through sort of 4 different ideas. One is sort of the initial idea of capturing Arizona elk, how to transport them from Yellowstone to Arizona, then trying to set aside a game refuge to protect them once they were here, and then how we're going to pay for it. So that's sort of the story of where we're going with this. So first of all, what are elk? Well, elk are large deer. They can range up to 700 pounds. There are 5 different types. There is the eastern elk in the upper Ohio River Valley, the plains elk, which traditionally went from Canada as far south as Oklahoma, the Rocky Mountain elk that go through Colorado and into Idaho, Montana, and up into Canada, the Roosevelt elk, which were really up through the Olympics and really along the northwest coast, the Thule elk, which were around California, and Miriams elk, which was named for Seahart Miriam. And their traditional area is New Mexico and Arizona. Miriam's elk were not identified as a subspecies until they were extinct in 1905. They were thought to be larger, a darker head, a larger antlers, There are some prehistoric drawings of maybe what were Miriams Elk going way back. And then by the time they identified them, they had been exterminated. And the last elk were probably seen in the White Mountains around 1904 or 1905. What brought about their demise? Well, it's a number of things. The introduction of cattle and sheep in Arizona. Elk were used to supply railroad builders, and so they were used for meat for railroaders. But really the sheep and cows were diminishing the carrying capacity of the land and really putting these animals into danger. That said, I actually found quite a bit of stories about Miriam's elk, excuse me there. These are all articles I found through the digital newspapers. We'll take a look at this one. Local intelligence from the Weekly Arizona Miner, Prescott, September 17th, 1875. These three guys started or about to start on a raid against a band of elk said to be ranging at the base of Bill Williams Mountain. They may swing around towards San Francisco Mountain and stir up a nest of bears on the return. And it is thought that the price of elk and bear skins, as well as the flesh of the animals, will be considerably reduced in this market. So this is in Prescott. They're talking about going for hunts around San Francisco Mountain. Of course, Flagstaff isn't there in 1875. And so they're talking about that. Here's another one from the Arizona Weekly Citizen in Tucson from 1883. A few elk remain in the northern part of Arizona, but there are none in the south that we've heard of. So within 8 years, or within 1 year of the railroad coming across northern Arizona, elk are starting to fall away. We're starting to lose them in northern Arizona. By 1896, the Arizona Daily Star, elk have been all but exterminated in this country. And the report of a herd of 11 having been seen north of Mary's Peak, nor Corvallis, really silly, excited comment in the far northwest. And so you're saying they're gone here, but people are excited about them elsewhere. The Territorial Seal of Arizona had an elk on it, which is sort of interesting. Some have said this was a deer, some said it was an elk. It's interesting that this Territorial Seal hardly has a cactus in it. When we think about the license plates today, it's hard to get anything but a cactus. But this is the Territorial Seal, which again, with the capital in Prescott for part of the time, makes sense. Already by 1885, somebody was commenting in Tucson, the Great Seal of the Territory of Arizona should be revised. There was a time when the huge elk in the foreground represented something, but that day is long past. The elk has gone, mostly in its place should be filled by a burro as the most appropriate emblem. And so people were already by 1885 talking about its demise and its symbolism, that it no longer was the symbol of Arizona. By 1905, Arizona's Miriam elk were gone. And if we think about it, between 1905 and 1913, there were no elk in Arizona. We go for walks. I live off of Lake Mary Road. We take our dog for walks out in the forest just about every day. We often see elk. It would be such an amazing thing to think that there were no elk anywhere in the state at that time. As Arizona was having problems, there were other problems around the country as well. Elk had been exterminated in many parts of the Rocky Mountain elk. One of the last bastions of elk was Yellowstone National Park, and there the elk numbers were huge. After the Army came in and started patrolling the park and keeping poachers at bay, elk numbers soared. And the elk would migrate north, they would also migrate south, and they would come into Jackson Hole. And in Jackson Hole in the early 1900s, there were so many elk that they were over the carrying capacity of the land in Jackson Hole, and they were starving to death. And farmers started to feed them. And finally, in 1912, the federal government established the National Elk Refuge in Jackson Hole. And these were basically the Yellowstone elk that would migrate out of the park to the south, and then they would raise crops for them to feed them. And so there's sort of an interesting thing. Elk are being decimated in parts like in Arizona, and in other places they are in abundance. It's a supply and demand issue. They're not in the right place. And progressive managers at that time in the early 1900s, this is the height of the progressive movement of trying to manage things, decide what they really need to do is to start relocating them or translocating them, moving the elk from the places that they're starving to death to places that they could thrive. One of these places was in California. And in 1906, they moved Arizona elk, or they moved California elk from the sort of the coastal range into some of the national parks. And you can see this is a great story from 1906. They would capture them, and then they would tie them off and saw off their antlers so they would not be jabbing each other. Put them into these pens. What do you think it's like driving a cart like this with a dozen elk in the back jostling around? And then they would load them onto these cattle cars and ship them. Well, one of these places, so in 1912, Outdoor Life, which was sort of a hunting magazine, published an article about how managers in Yellowstone National Park had started moving elk out of the park into different places. W.B. Shore was a biologist, and he wrote this article about how they could do it and the success that they had doing this, trapping and shipping elk. And they showed the kind of pen that you need to have. Here are the elk near Gardner, Montana. So they would also leave and go to the north out of Yellowstone, to the north into Gardner, Montana. They would round them up into this pen, and then they would load them into these rail cars in Gardner. In 1906, between 1906 and 1920, Yellowstone shipped out over 3,000 elk to 30 different states. They sent them to Oklahoma. They sent them back east. They sent them to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Yellowstone elk were being sent all across the country to repopulate places where the native elk had been exterminated. One of these places was Arizona. This is the guy who was behind it all, Dr. Robert Looney, who was a doctor from Prescott. He had actually come to Arizona as a medical student, and then went back, finished his degree back east, and came back and started practice in Prescott. He was a hunter. He was very much into wildlife. For a while, he introduced pheasant into the area around Prescott, but they were mostly all killed off by coyote. And he read the story in Outdoor Life in 1912 about trapping and relocating elk. And he said, you know what? We ought to do that. Well, he had recently been appointed the state superintendent of health, or the state's first doctor. And he worked very closely with the first governor, George W.P. Hunt from Globe. And they did this through a set of letters, which is now this beautiful little archive online at the Arizona Memory Project, Correspondence Concerning the Elk. And I show as well the two Elk Lodges, the one in Phoenix and the one in Prescott, because the Elk Lodges of Arizona paid for this. They paid the cost through membership donations to bring elk back to Arizona. We can go to the beginning, the very first letter. And so if you can read along with me, I don't know how well you can see this. I'm just going to read this to sort of show how sort of out of hand this was. This is from Looney to Hunt in August of 1912. I'm writing you regarding an application for the appointment of state game warden. Since I saw you, I had a talk with Mr. Adams, also a number of people interested in the protection of game in the state of Arizona. And he talks about how he would be a good person to protect the game. I've taken up the matter of this with the state game warden of Montana with the idea of shipping a few carloads of elk to this state. I have reason to believe that they can be had by paying $5 a head for capturing them and loading them onto cars for shipment. And if this is so, I think Arizona should ship a few carloads in You may be surprised if I call on you sometime to talk about this. So he's talking about a letter to the governor. And the governor responds, talking first of all that he's going to be, I'll see you at the International Congress on Hygiene. And then he also says, while you're in Washington, secure permission for a shipment of a carload of elk to Arizona. And Governor Hunt was behind it. And from the beginning, this was a very interesting relationship as told through these many letters. I also looked through the newspapers, and because all these newspapers have been digitized, I could show that this was really a statewide effort, that everyone around the state, from Flagstaff to Holbrook to Bisbee to Globe to Phoenix to Yuma to Prescott to Tucson to St. John's, all were behind it. And you find stories about it throughout between 1912 and 1914. 61 different newspaper articles from throughout the state, all talking about bringing elk to Arizona and bringing them back. Pretty amazing just how many there were. The questions, though, were really sort of interesting, and this is really at the heart of what the correspondence about is. Whose elk are they? Who is Looney going to write to get permission? Do they belong? It's in Yellowstone. Do they belong to Wyoming? Well, when they leave and go to Gardner, do they belong to Montana? Do they belong to Yellowstone? If they belong to Yellowstone, do they belong to the National Park Service? No, they don't belong to the National Park Service because the National Park Service doesn't exist yet. Instead, who does he write to get permission to buy some elk? The United States Army, because they are in charge of Yellowstone National Park in 1913. And so he has to write a letter to the acting superintendent, a lieutenant colonel, to try to get permission. And he says, yeah, we'd be great. We have elk to spare. How much is it going to cost? What about shipping them? Who's going to trap them? Who can somebody feed them? Can somebody stay on the train and let them out every other day someplace to feed them? What kinds of elk? Males, females, young, old? How are you going to get them? How are you going to do that? How are they going to get to Arizona? Where are they going to go in Arizona? Initially, the thought was they're going to go to Flagstaff, but then they didn't. They changed their mind and said, we're going to take them to Winslow and then south of Winslow. And how are we going to pay for it? Yeah, the Elk Lodge said they'll pay for it, but they also got unsolicited donations from the Boone and Crockett Club. The Boone and Crockett Club was an organization that had been started in the 1880s by Teddy Roosevelt as a hunting organization. Named for Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, the Boone and Crockett Club was an organization that helped pass game laws around the country, or to write game laws. And the Boone and Crockett Club wanted to be involved. And so throughout all this correspondence, 55 different letters in this correspondence concerning the elk, all of this stuff is being discussed with people in Montana, with the parks, with the Army, with wildlife managers, with the Department of Interior, with people in Winslow, with fellow lodge members. It's really fascinating just to go through these 55 letters. A couple samples. Looney wrote to Henry Anderson, and Henry Anderson was a well-known hunter and trapper in Yellowstone, which is sort of an interesting idea. We don't talk today too much about trappers in a national park, okay? What was he trapping? Wolves, bears, predators, okay? By October of 1912, Looney could write, I have a permit from the Interior Department to capture and ship 2 carloads of elk, not to exceed a number 40 to the car, from Yellowstone to the public range of Arizona. And he basically wants to hire Anderson to do the trapping. When they come out into Gardner, trap some, get 40, get 80 for us. We can put them in train cars. We'll pay you. We'll pay for it. We don't have Gardner's reply, but we have Looney's next letter to him. And he says, I've received your letter saying that you have captured the elk in January of 1913. Hold them there and feed them. Well, I'm making arrangements to ship them on 3 different trains. They're going to go from Gardner to Billings on the Northern Pacific, from Billings to Denver on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and from Denver to Winslow on the Santa Fe. Let me know what the shipping cost is. Let me know what the feeding costs are. And then we have actually in the process the receipt from Yellowstone National Park for 80 elk to be transported. In fact, he got 85. He got 5 extra just in case. Looney also wrote to the Boone and Crockett Club. I mentioned them, and I just want to share this because it was basically a summary of his plan. And he's refusing the donation at this time, but he's basically explaining what his plan is to do. We have arranged to feed the elk at their new location. We have an experienced man to come with the elk. The elk will not arrive at Winslow until February 10th, and by that time, winter is practically over in northern Arizona. Keep that in mind because we'll come back to that. I realize the necessity of handling them in the proper way. He's given ideas. He's also talked about a game refuge. The Boone and Crockett Club is creating legislation for a game preserve. So once they're here, they can't be hunted and they'll be protected. He also writes to the head of the U.S. Biological Survey in January of 1913, telling him that we're following his advice about how to ship them. We're going to take them to Chevelon Creek, about 40 miles south of Winslow. So once they are in Winslow on the train, they're going to have to reload them into these horse-drawn wagons again and take them 40 miles south into the White Mountains. Talking again about winter should be over. This is the area. We've also received your information about how to set up a game refuge. I've talked with a number of senators or representatives, and there's no doubt at all, but this section will be set aside, and very likely there will be a bill passed making a closed season for deer for the next 3 to 5 years. I don't believe there will be any opposition to the formation of the state game preserve by stockmen. Keep that in mind as well, because that's not going to happen either. And then also that the Boone and Crockett Club doesn't need to donate the money because the Elk Lodges of Arizona are going to step in and pay for the cost. And all around the state, they're going to do it. Well, the elk are shipped. I actually went into the national newspaper database. I found an article from Sheridan, Wyoming. Hundreds of visitors were attracted to the stockyard Sunday by the news that a herd of 85 yearling elk on their way from Yellowstone Park to Flagstaff, Arizona had been unloaded at Sheridan. The shipment was in charge of government employee. Hundreds of elk are being shipped out of the park and at Jackson Hole. The elk reached Sheridan Saturday night, making a 24-hour stay, and people just turned out. Albuquerque Journal, February, 10 days later. 2 stock cars of elk in transit from Yellowstone Park to Arizona passed through Albuquerque late Wednesday night. There is correspondence from New Mexico managers, game managers, writing to Looney. How are you doing it? Well, they work in Arizona and New Mexico as well. And then the Weekly Miner reports, big band of elk reaches Winslow. And people were just shocked. And Winslow, this was the biggest thing that had ever happened in Winslow. In fact, the title of my article comes out of the Winslow paper, The Most Interesting Objects That Have Ever Arrived. This is the newspaper, the Winslow Mail, February 15th, 1913. Arrival of elk sets town agog. Have you seen the elk? That's the question that everybody's been asking everybody else. If you haven't seen them, you must belong to the small minority in town who has failed to visit the stockyards to see the most interesting objects that have ever arrived in Winslow. And here are pictures of them in the stockyards of Winslow, including this great little postcard that I found on the internet from 1913, February 25th, 1913. Hello, Daddy Lee, just a few minutes to write. This is a picture of a few elk, 83 in all, that are to be turned loose in Arizona. 83, well, one had died by Denver, and they removed it, and another died between Denver and Winslow. But they kept them there and fed them for about 3 weeks in the stockyards of Winslow. On February 27th, 22nd, just before they were ready to ship them, Winslow received 7 inches of snow. It was the biggest snowfall in 7 years. Flagstaff got about 2 feet of snow. When they went to ship them out, they loaded them up into these carts similar to the ones in California. They actually kept them, all the carts, in a giant pen, first of all in Winslow, to make sure that if any of them escaped, they couldn't get away from there. They set out at 4 a.m. with 83 elk in 12 horse-drawn wagons pulled by 2 horses each. A couple other cowboys, these were all Elk Lodge members, following along, making sure none of them escaped. They go 25 miles south of Winslow, stop at a sheep camp. It starts sleeting. By the next morning, they're sleeping in 3 or 4 inches of new snow. They finally make it down to Chevelon Creek by dusk the second day in 10 inches of new snow. And by the time they leave the next morning, 18 inches of new snow. And so winter had not ended in northern Arizona. In fact, they brought the elk into the biggest snowstorm in many years in northern Arizona. And this is sort of the country today done by Chevelon Creek in the White Mountains where the elk were released. What about the Game Refuge? As all of this was going on, northern Arizona stockmen began lobbying against the Game Refuge. They did not want the government setting aside land that they had set up for cattle and sheep to be turned over and not be able to be used. They sent this guy, J.B. Stiles of Winslow, who was a Indian trader and rancher, and he lobbied in the Arizona legislature from Winslow against this idea of creating a game refuge. In the newspaper article, I actually go through the vote and analyze it, and pretty much all of the votes in favor that lost both in the Arizona House and Senate were from Phoenix and Tucson and Prescott. All of the locals voted against it. All of the rural people voted against it. The stockmen in that section of the country bitterly opposed the bill and defeated it. And so there was going to be no game refuge. Now, it was illegal to hunt elk going back to the 1880s, and so they could not be hunted, but there was no special game refuge established for them at the same time in 1913. How did Arizona pay for it? Each lodge of the Arizona Elks contributed money. Globe, $200. Anybody know why Globe provides so much? It's where Governor Hunt was from. Kingman, Winslow, Prescott, Flagstaff, Phoenix, Yuma, Bisbee, Tucson, Douglas. Everybody contributed, but the most, again, also came from the South. Winslow, Flagstaff, Holbrook, these were some of the smallest contributions. And so we're seeing the difference in payment as well as in the votes. What does this all mean? Already we're starting to see a little bit of this state split between rural populations and urban populations. People in Phoenix wanted the rural Arizona to be wild. It was a playground, a good place to go hunt, a place to go tour. Local ranchers who saw this as animals competing for grass and water didn't want the elk there. And so we're starting to see that very much a north and south split. This is very much part of hybrid nature. These are not native elk. These are imported elk, okay? It's also part of this animal history story. And I just want to read you a little bit out of my article to tell you a little bit of this way of looking at this from the animal's perspective, if we can try to see that. So thinking about this from the elk perspective, on a cold January day, as the herd grazed north from Yellowstone Park near the railroad town of Gardner, a government hunter captured 85 of them from their native land, corralled them in a pen for 23 days, and they ate an imported grass for 3 weeks. After more than 3 weeks, the men herded the elk again and forced them into railroad cars that had burlap tacked to the inside so that no one could see in and the elk could not see out. The train cars then took off at a pace that the elk had never experienced, covering 1,400 miles in the next 11 days. Every day on the journey, men again unloaded them into pens next to the tracks where they happened to be and fed them hay before forcing them back into the stock cars. Their cars switched railroads twice, once in Billings and Denver. It had to be very unnerving to the animals because one elk died along the way, although no one discovered that until they were in Denver, and then another one died from Denver. Once unloaded in Winslow, they remained for 2 weeks eating hay and seeing probably more humans than elk had ever seen before. They were then loaded up into wagons again in a snowstorm and shipped further south 45 miles. One escaped, walked into a sheep herder's camp where he befriended him and gave him some milk and then carried him bound to where they found the rest of them. Another part of animal history, though, I think also tells us another interesting story. And there's a really good book called The Historical Animal that sort of looks at this. And if we think about how these elk were loaded up into pens, put onto railroad cars and shipped off and then let loose someplace else, does that forced relocation have any resonance in Arizona? Of course it does. The Bisbee deportation during World War I seems very much like this. You have a gauntlet of men forcing these radical laborers onto railroad cars where they're taken to New Mexico and let loose. It seems almost as a precursor to that. Well, over the next 70 years, Arizona brought more and more elk to where eventually we brought about 350 elk to Arizona. That is now the basis of the 35,000 that are here today. The elk not only did very well in Arizona, primarily because of more water that has been made available because of dams and because of many of the tanks out in the field in Arizona, in the forests of Arizona. But also, Arizona has some of the largest prized elk. And some people have speculated whether maybe some of those Miriam elk actually survived. And they were way back in the mountains. And when the Rocky Mountain elk came in, they crossbred with them. And these are super elk. And that's actually led Arizona game managers to capture some of these elk and do DNA analysis. And they're all Rocky Mountain elk. There are no Miriam elk left anymore. They're Rocky Mountain elk, very much like this picture. So that's about it. I feel like I sort of zipped through that, but does anybody have any questions? And please turn on your microphones and we can take a look in the chat room as well. I can stop the share.
Michael, it's Gwen. I have a question.
Yeah.
Are any of these original travels by rail and all of that, are they still using those same migratory patterns, or did they naturally change those over time?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking.
Well, you know, I always think of elk kind of moving from one place to another with the season.
Yep.
Does any of their movement relate back to the original herds that were brought over?
I'm not sure I still understand. So you're asking that, do the elk in the White Mountains migrate back up to Winslow?
Well, basically, not necessarily all the way, but are they in the same paths where they were originally taken to?
No, they have spread, and they were spread within the first 6 months. There were already newspaper reports of people seeing elk around Flagstaff, around Hart Prairie in Flagstaff. There were also elk distributed in the White Mountains. There were elk distributed in southern Arizona on the San Carlos Indian Reservation. There were elk distributed over by Kingman, where there had never been elk in the first place. And so the elk that came to Arizona, as far as I understand, basically had to figure it out themselves. And it's really sort of interesting because there was actually a study by the Arizona game manager. How did those first 83 do? Well, 77 of them survived. Actually, 6 of them died over the winter. And they found them dead very close to where they'd been released in that first pen. And what they believed happened is they just didn't know where to go. And the report by the game manager was that that part of Arizona had been, I'm using his words, sheeped out, meaning the sheep had eaten the grass down to the stubble in that part. So there wasn't really good grass there. And 6 of the elk that died the first winter. They had 4 offspring of the first 83. And so actually the first year, they turned out with less than they started with. But then they did very well after that, and they kept bringing more and more in. They got to where they would just start to bring them by rail, and they took them on the Grand Canyon Railroad and just let them loose out of the railroad cars as well. So I don't know about the actual migrations within. I think this has all been new learned behavior in Arizona.
Thank you. This has been really interesting.
Thank you. Anybody else? Do we have any questions in the chat?
You do have a question in the chat. Let's see. Gina Marie.
The Rocky Mountain elk did not migrate down to Arizona. They were migrating out of Yellowstone, and at least the ones that came from, all the ones that came to Arizona came from Yellowstone. But they were also being used to repopulate Rocky Mountain National Park as well. So they were taking the Yellowstone elk all around the country. My understanding is that none of them came on their own from Colorado or Utah into Arizona. All of the Arizona elk are descendants of ones that came by train. That's just such an odd thing. And when we think about the things that have come by train to northern Arizona, my wife Lauren is the archivist at Lowell Observatory, and that big telescope came in a Palace passenger car to Flagstaff. Elk have come to northern Arizona as well, that I've talked about. So it must have been just absolutely fascinating to see these elk in a train car like that. Any other questions? Well, I think as you think about Arizona, Arizona is a hybrid place. I'm not a native Arizonan, but those elk aren't a native Arizonan either. We're all part of this rebuilt population. The population of elk, about 35,000, including several large herds right around Lake Mary that we see oftentimes, are just absolutely fascinating. So they're all descendants. We are all descendants of someplace else. Are there any elk heads in your hunter's cabin there, Nikki?
We do not have any elk in the Riordan collection. We do have deer and a buffalo, but no elk.
It's interesting when the elk came back, they didn't actually do a hunt until the 1950s, was when the first hunt was held, and it was limited to, anybody want to guess who could hunt for the first elk? Only members of the Elk Lodges of Arizona, because they had brought them back. then of course, it's certainly been opened up since then. They're so ubiquitous in Arizona today. We just think they've always been here. It must have been crazy here for those 8 years when there were absolutely no elk here. So, well, thank you so much, Nikki, and glad to be here. And thanks everybody for coming and spending a little bit of time with me about this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming out, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Amundson, for sharing this great story.
Great. Thanks.
Have a great day.